The canopy was suspended over a complex network of rigging, which in turn was anchored by 240 masts that encircle the uppermost tier of the building. Ropes ran down from the top masts to capstans at pavement level. To raise or lower the velarium, they had to be winched in perfect unison. Marshaled by beating drums, the giant awning would be inched into position. Whenever it was periodically lowered and raised, at least 1,000 men would have been needed.
The velarium, we are told by Pliny the Elder, was a very thin sheet of silk, which was also embroidered with gold stars. So the scenic effect with the glint of the sun must have been extremely beautiful.
The velarium was the Colosseum's crowning glory. With its installation, the building was finally complete, only 12 years after the first stone had been laid. In that time, the Colosseum had become Rome's main attraction. A typical day started with the display of wild beasts brought from all over the empire.
Romans had the image to themselves that they were masters of the world. And one of the ways in which they could demonstrate their mastery of the world was to bring the most exotic creatures they could find, bring them to Rome and to exhibit them. We truly are the masters of the world. So they brought giraffes, leopards, lions, bears, ostriches, hippopotamuses, rhinoceroses, everything. But the Romans, instead of idly watching the animals in captivity, brought them into the arena and killed them. Different culture, different practices.
This slaughter was not simply bloodlust. To a Roman citizen, it was a demonstration of the empire's domination over uncivilized nature.
The central moment of Roman ritual life is the sacrifice of an animal. To worship a god, you sacrifice an animal. You kill the animal, you slit its throat. So seeing a bull, a pig, a lamb, a chicken killed was, for Roman, the central point of religious service. I think the sacrifices of animals or of humans in the Colosseum was carrying that religious symbolism just one step further.
Following the animal show came the public executions of criminals. The condemned's position in society dictated how they were to die. Slaves and common criminals were crucified, some set alight as they writhed upon the cross. Most criminals were thrown to the lions and torn to death to the crowd's delight. The animals were not always willing executioners. Terrified by the baying crowd and weak from maltreatment, they needed extra incentives for attack. Underground, stagehands daubed the condemned with fresh blood in order to drive the beasts into a feeding frenzy. Prisoners were even tied to a stake and pushed onto cornered animals to guarantee their mauling.
In the center of the day, sometimes there were not only executions just killing people, but there were dramatic reenactments of myths. So that, or sexual plays in which animals were said to have intercourse with convicted criminals. But say the end, the denouement of the myth was the criminal was cruelly executed, covered with a cape soaked in pitch and set alight for the enjoyment and pleasure of the crowd.
Yet all this bloodshed was simply the appetizer for the main event. The gladiators, the superstars of the Colosseum, its champions of death. Gladiatorial combat was the Colosseum's main attraction, the highlight of a day's sport. The demand for gladiatorial fights was so great a whole industry was developed to train up and equip a constant supply of fighters for the games. The Colosseum supported 4 gladiatorial schools, a combination of training camps and prisons, as the majority of fighters were slaves or prisoners of war. At full capacity, they housed 2,000 gladiators, drawn from all over the empire. Underground tunnels led directly into the subterranean labyrinth of the arena. The only means of escape was through victory or death. Training schools developed under the guidance of Lannistai, former gladiators who had fought and survived for more than 3 years. It was their job to make sure that the fighters reached the arena in peak condition. With such highly trained warriors, a typical training session could develop into a brawl where personal scores were settled. At times like this, the tutor would have to stamp his authority. Female fighters were also popular with Roman audiences. Emperors Domitian and Commodus delighted in watching women fight to the death. A novice fighter started his training using a blunt wooden sword called a rudis, with a wooden post for his opponent. More experienced fighters trained against each other, but their weapons were still blunted. These were not only valuable but dangerous men. They were only issued sharpened weapons when they reached the Colosseum. The gladiators entered the arena through the Gate of Life, the Porta Sanevivaria. Gladiators defended themselves with shields, their swords too brittle to deflect direct attacks. A broken sword meant almost certain defeat. Each fighter was given a ranking. The highest ranked had huge status and market value. Some of the fighters were sold for the equivalent of £160,000. Betting on fights was a passion second only to watching the spectacle. Fight statistics were obsessively recorded and argued over by fans. Experienced fighters were often matched against novices to improve their victory tally and value. Medals and laurel wreaths were bestowed on the champions. Even when vanquished, a gladiator might stand a chance of overcoming death if he had impressed the emperor with his skill and courage. A gladiator would plead for mercy by raising his hand. The baying crowd often influenced the emperor's decision. Sparing a crowd's favorite was good public relations.
The truth is, no one knows whether the Romans put their thumbs up or their thumbs down. We know they put them in one direction, and everyone knew what the meaning was. But we use it as a term of convention. Thumbs up, survive. Thumbs down, death.
Slaves dressed as Charon, the demon of death, used a ceremonial hammer to dispatch any vanquished gladiators showing signs of life. For a society obsessed with conquest and virility, there was no honor in defeat. Victory, however, promised great rewards. The most successful gladiators won their freedom from slavery, and were rewarded a ceremonial wooden practice sword that signified their liberation. Amazingly, many chose to return to the arena, unable to resist the thrill of the fight, the fame, and their status as sex symbols.
The Latin word gladius means sword, and so the gladiator is a swordsman. But gladius also means, colloquially, penis. And so they were sex symbols. Celitus, which means crowds roar, or someone, the netter of young girls by night, they were seen as people with virility.